This is Politics and the Exilic City with Nojang Hatami and Zain Mirab, a podcast about the experience of exile and in-betweenness, the possibilities of sustaining resistance in marginal spaces, and the politics of movement and migration. We're recording today just a little over 24 hours since the US and Israeli forces launched a military campaign in Iran, and we wanted to take a moment to respond and frame the moment.
Yeah, we're thinking that it's important to talk about what's currently happening, especially because there's a lot of confusion and a lot of misinformation, especially if you're following this on mainstream media outlets. And so, what we want to talk about in this brief episode is first, what has actually happened in the past 24 hours, and what have been the claims of Israel and the United States in launching these attacks. We want to talk about how support has been manufactured for this attempt at regime change. And part of that is going to have to do with the significance of the January protests and the lead up to all of this. Part of it also has to do with the role of the Iranian diaspora and the ways that they have been calling for and reacting to these attempts at regime change. And fourthly, we're going to talk about what are the aims of Iran and the United States and Israel. What is each nation looking to get out of this? And what are their goals? How are they likely to react to each other's responses and attacks in the coming days? And finally, what are the possible larger outcomes in the coming days? What can we expect now that the events have unfolded the way that they have? So we're going to get into each of these things in turn in our discussion today.
Great. Well, so let's start at the beginning, Nurjang. Can you walk us through what took place in the first 24 hours, including the US and Israeli claims justifying the military action?
Yes. And so everyone who has followed this and who many people woke up to this news yesterday. We're recording this now. It's Sunday. Yesterday morning on Saturday, many people woke up to this news that at 2 a.m. Eastern time, around there were the first waves of attacks that Israel launched and essentially declared what they called a kind of military operation against Iran. Shortly after that, in about an hour, we had Donald Trump making this statement in his hat about this sort of new campaign and these what he called major combat operations against Iran. And the language that he used was one of annihilation, of obliteration, of devastation, and essentially claiming that Iran is a threat to America, right? And this is something that he has repeated several times. So we're going to come to the claims and the attempted sort of justifications for all of this. But before we do, I think it's also important to just really quickly recap the timeline of events and what actually the attacks look like and the sort of impact that they've had, again, over the past 24 hours. So when Israel and the United States launched these attacks, within hours, they hit numerous targets in many different parts of Iran, practically across the whole country, from Shiraz and Bandar Abbas in the south to Tehran and the surrounding area, and as far as Kermanshah and Tabriz in the west and the northwest. And so it's been all over the country where we've been seeing bombs and missiles hitting many different targets, including many civilian targets, which is, of course, not unprecedented because we saw this in the June so-called 12-day war against Iran launched by these two same countries. One of the first targets to be hit, and this is something that I think many people have seen, was a girls' elementary school, which as of yesterday, there were initially reports of up to 80 young girls who had been killed in this attack. And now the estimates are upwards of 100. And in all of these heartbreaking and devastating attacks that have taken place, there's been an attempt to justify it, right? And to say that this was necessary, that this is a kind of intervention that was needed, in part, and this is going to be among the claims, in part to try to supposedly, liberate the Iranian people. This is something else that Trump has repeated numerous times. But there are also, of course, things that the United States and Israel has wanted to gain out of this. And I think we really also should be thinking and talking about those things as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I found most striking about the early announcement from Donald Trump about the military action was that he had placed Americans and American safety as a central justification. And the question that popped into my head was, which Americans is he
Mm,
talking about?
mhm.
And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how support has been manufactured. Here, I'm thinking about a piece that I was just reading in the Boston Review by Alex Shams, where he talks about how millions have been spent to create this idea that Pahlavi is the heir apparent to a regime change. I think that these things are all working together. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's very important, right? So on the one hand, and I think a lot of these forces are kind of have been working in conjunction with each other to manufacture support for all of this, right? So on the one hand, there are all of these claims that the US and Israel have been making for a very long time, actually, about how Iran poses a supposed existential threat, right? This is something that, again, we saw in the previous attacks last summer how there's this imminent threat, supposedly, of Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon. This is, of course, something that Israel, for example, Netanyahu in particular, has been saying for over 3 decades. So, as far back as the 1990s, he's been claiming that Iran is on the verge of having a bomb. There's, of course, not only is there no actual evidence for this, nor has there ever been, even most recently, as Iran was at the negotiating table and talking about working with IAEA inspectors, which they have, again, there are no actual credible claims about Iran posing an existential threat in any way in that sense, right? The other claim is that Iran has been a destabilizing force in the region and that, through its proxies and so on, it's continuing to destabilize everything. Again, for anybody who's been paying attention, you look at how actually weakened Iran has become because of all of these attacks by Israel in particular against, for example, Hezbollah and, the Houthis and so on. Again, there's very little credibility there about Iran continuing to pose a serious threat through those means. But thirdly, and I think most importantly, because this has been the major part of the narrative, there is this claim that one, the Iranian people want this, right? There's this idea that all Iranians, including within Iran as well as in the diaspora, have been calling for intervention by Israel and the United States. So there are many in the diaspora in particular, of course, who do, right? I think, and this is what we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about. There are many people in the diaspora, particularly across North America and Europe and elsewhere. There are, of course, millions of Iranians now, living outside of Iran, and they have been very vocal. And we'll come to the reasons for that. But they essentially have been claiming that people inside Iran have also been calling, as you pointed out, for a kind of savior figure like Reza Pahlavi to come in and liberate the people and to work with the United States and with Israel to try to make that happen. So that again is part of what the rest of this sort of analysis and this explainer is going to focus on is again exactly how this sort of support has been manufactured essentially from the outside, how so much of this has come from what the diaspora has been saying because they also get, a lot of attention, a lot of airtime on various outlets as well as on social media. And so a lot of what we get about what Iranians actually want tends to come from the perspective of those in the diaspora. And so there are, I think, important points here to also address as to how that has happened and why the diaspora has been so vocal, and to also offer a critical perspective on this, right? So for me personally, as someone who is among that diaspora, but I tend to take different views from the majority of people in the Iranian diaspora. But I also think it's important for us to be able to talk about this together And for those who are cheering this on, especially now after the assassination of Khamenei and the
Mhm.
possible repercussions that are going to come out of that, I think it's a really important moment for us to be talking about the role of the diaspora here.
Yeah, when I think about, or when I'm listening to the commentary about Iran, one of the things that's most striking to me is the overwhelmingly broad brushstrokes that people paint Iran in. And as far as I know, there's actually multiple viewpoints, right? Of course, there are the monarchists. They're primarily in the diaspora. There's, possibly people within Iran who are also monarchists. And there are people who are supporters of the Islamic Republic. At the same time, that there are also people who are wanting a democratic system to take the place of that government. And so I've been really overwhelmed by, again, just the grand totalizing claims. And for me, when I'm talking with students, I always say when we're making these broad totalizing statements about groups, that's a moment, that's a red flag moment. That's a moment for you to
Hmm.
take a step back and ask, okay, what is being glossed in these portrayals? But that brings me to the third point that I was hoping, or that, we were talking about getting clarity on, is like thinking about the significance of the January protests just last month, the role of the diaspora in terms of how they were talking about it, and what people that you're in contact with in Iran itself have been saying about those protests.
Yeah. So for one, I think the when it comes to the diaspora and why they have been so vocal and often really aggressive, right, when it comes to putting forward their views, of saying that anybody who is opposed to their vision of what the future of Iran should be is, for example, the kind of language that they use is that, you're an IRGC terrorist supporter, or that and this is like I'm putting it lightly, right? Like, I mean, I'm not even using the kind of language that they use to denounce anybody who disagrees with their viewpoints. Now,
And
here's Mhm.
just as a quick to show kind of the international scope of this. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm living in a small town in southern France, and I've texted you when I see the monarchists who are in the middle of the public square in this small town, and they're there every afternoon, and they're waving, this lion flag, and they are saying the things that you're saying to passersby. And I think it's been really astounding for me to see the tenaciousness of
Mm.
this belief that they hold. And so I wanted to add that in there to kind of
Yeah.
give backing to what you're saying, which is like, yes, you are saying it in the most gentle way possible, some of the things that they're saying themselves, which I'll just say in the context of France, sometimes I think reads as Islamophobic, and then it's falling on the ears of these French people who also hold Islamophobic views, and it's really just alarming to see the way that they leverage that discourse.
Yeah, it often gets very ugly, right? And this is again why I get so concerned about it, because of course I talk to all like Iranians in general. I think we need to be having these conversations, right? But what has become really difficult is because of the ways that so monarchists in particular, are often not just vocal, but again, very aggressive and very hostile in sharing their views, and again, completely dismiss or attack anybody who disagrees with them. It's become really difficult even to have discussions, right? Including in online spaces where again they tend to dominate often the discussions, right? Whether it's on, social media posts or in comments, or sometimes people just like messaging you on social media, basically attacking you and saying, we have this term vatan furush, which means that you're supposedly, you're selling your nation and your people down the river because you don't agree with their viewpoints, right? Or like you're a traitor to all Iranians because you disagree with what monarchists say, and so therefore you must be a supporter of everything that the
Mhm.
Islamic Republic has done and does.
It's a real
Um,
lack of political imagination.
I, that puts it so perfectly. I think that's exactly how I think about it, and why I think we have to have these conversations, right?
Mhm.
That really has become an issue in our diaspora. And like this is something that I try to say to people, to fellow Iranians, living abroad. I try to approach with the in like the gentlest way possible, and like with a real like a spirit of dialogue as much as
Mm-hmm.
possible, to say like, Barodaron, Khoharan, brothers, sisters, like let's actually think about this and talk about this together.
Mm-hmm.
And not just simply attack or dismiss anybody who has a different perspective or a nuanced view, and who is actually trying to be attentive to the complexities of what is going on. And I think exactly that summarizes it so well. It's a lack of political imagination, because it's this view that, again, if you don't agree with this one particular savior figure in this case, and the ideologies and the forces and the powers that he is attached to, particularly Israel and the United States,
Mm-hmm.
and this ongoing problem of coming to these kinds of rallies with Israel and US flags, and using this very hostile and violent language of like, all the mullahs and everything and everybody involved with them need to be killed. Like, I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
becomes a really violent discourse, and it's really unproductive, I think, right? And especially in the context of what is happening right now and the possibilities that might still lie ahead, right? Which we'll come to. But to expand on this point about why the diaspora is like this, and what might be a possible way for us to engage and to have kind of more nuanced discussions. I think it is in many ways understandable that many in the diaspora have felt a lot of resentment, right? So, and we talked about this in a previous sort of preview episode that we had, when it came to the case of Venezuela and Venezuelan exiles, and there are a number of others as well, right? Cuban exiles, et cetera. There's that tendency to harbor this kind of resentment when you have been forced to leave, and many have felt that they had no other choice but to leave Iran because of the living conditions, because of the lack of freedoms and civil liberties, as well as the economic circumstances, which many people could not live with. So that it is understandable in many ways that people are going to have these resentments, and that they're going to carry them like baggage wherever they go. At the same time, the resentment tends to turn into a kind of hatred. It becomes very hostile, and again, goes in different directions, right? So it is largely and principally directed at the Iranian government and the figure of like the now deceased Ayatollah Khamenei, and anybody sort of associated with him and anybody affiliated with the government. But then it also, again, projects itself onto other people in the diaspora, as well as Iranians themselves living in Iran, who are in many ways opposed to the regime. But those who are not necessarily on board with this one particular vision of having Reza Pahlavi come in and be the savior, even those Iranians who are living with this shit themselves, they become the subjects of this kind of denunciation and of, again, very hostile attacks of like, oh, they don't even know what they want, or like they've been brainwashed because they've been living, under the
Mm-hmm.
Islamic Republic. And it's like just the audacity of that, right? To be out of the
Mm-hmm.
country, and to be disconnected with people. And then the worst way that that has translated itself into support for this war, and previous attacks, is that when bombs are falling on the heads of Iranians inside Iran, people in the diaspora are cheering that on,
Yeah. So
or
disturbing.
just saying that like, well, this is necessary, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're just going to have to suffer through this, so
Yeah.
that everybody else can be liberated. So again, in some ways, it is expected and it's understandable that, like many other diasporas, people are going to harbor these kinds of resentments. But once it turns into this vile kind of hatred, for anybody that's opposed to them, I think that's where the real problem is. When it comes to the figure of Reza Pahlavi, again, I think you mentioned this very helpful and illuminating article by Alex Shams. There's also another one by Iskandar Sadeghi and Golnar Nikpur, who wrote this together in the Jacobin magazine back in the summer. So rather than elaborate much more on those, I would just recommend those to anybody who wants to follow up on this.
And we'll
But
be putting
yeah,
links to all of these pieces in the show notes for folks
yes,
to follow up on.
yes, exactly. And so in order not to go on this at length, because you have those kind of incisive analyses out there already, just to again really emphasize the point that a figure like Reza Pahlavi is not only inexperienced and has not actually held a job or any kind of work that would prepare him for leadership in Iran, not to mention he's been out of the country for more than 40 years and has very few connections to the country itself or to people on the ground. There's the question of his wealth and how he uses that, how he has leveraged that in order to get his message out there, including on his own personal website. We don't know his exact net worth, but it's estimated to be in the hundreds of millions. And he doesn't have a massive media empire, but he has a lot of sway and a lot of manipulation that he is able to use, including on his own website, but also through the media outlets that platform him. Right. And this includes, of course, like Iran International, as well as many Western outlets like, CNN, BBC, and so on, especially on like BBC Farsi. They're constantly talking about him, right? Every time he makes a statement, oh, Reza Pahlavi said, go out into the streets and keep protesting. Or it's like, it doesn't matter if the bombs are falling. We're so close. Just keep going, right? And like Israel and the US will come and help us. All of this kind of stuff again has really proliferated, and many people again have bought into that. And those are part of among the reasons why he has come to be seen as a kind of savior figure. But let me spend.
I'm gonna
Go ahead.
chime in and say that I know that I know that you want to talk, and you prepared these really great clips about January and the January protests. And so I want to be sure that we spend some time talking about that.
Yes. So that's what I wanted to get to, is the other way in which support has been manufactured for this war and for these attacks and for this kind of intervention is that aside from the influence of people like Reza Pahlavi and other things that we've talked about, of course, many Iranians and many observers, right, and anybody who saw what happened over the past 2 months, really, right? It's because we're talking about early January, the kinds of horrific images that emerged out of Iran, including, some of which I'm going to highlight right now. And, before we get into this part, I really want to preface this and really highlight and emphasize the fact that as I talk about this and the things that I'm going to show, none of this at all is meant to in any way downplay or to deny that the Iranian government has, of course, been not only very repressive, but that, of course, there is all kinds of evidence, and anybody who has paid attention to this will know that the Iranian government has, of course, killed many of its own people, many innocent protesters, including very young people, and some of whom have been not only caught in the line of fire, but who have been targeted intentionally, as well as the many arrests, the detentions, the executions, and the pending executions. And of course, there are thousands of Iranians who, especially in early January, were slain. And this is horrible. It is something that I have denounced. And so in sharing these things, which I'm going to put up, none of this is at all to invalidate or to deny what the Iranian government has done. But the purpose of this is also to think about and to shed light on how support for this war in particular has been manufactured through a particular narrative that I think requires a little bit of nuance as well. And for us to know about how this did not just occur accidentally, and that it is the actions that the Iranian government took were in response to something important that I think we have to highlight. I'm going to share here a few important clips. One of these is from early on, again, as images came out of Iran in early January. And of course, there was an internet blackout that lasted over 3 weeks. And so the images that did come out were sparse, and there was lack of clarity about what was actually happening in Iran. And yet many of these kinds of images did get out. So this is one example that I'll share. And again, this is to really highlight the fact that the security forces were, of course, firing on people with live rounds. right? So in those kinds of videos, which again were widely shared, you have many of those kinds of images which document and which show, again, what actually security forces were doing, right, against protesters. There are, of course, many of these reports of the many bodies, dead bodies, as well as people critically wounded in hospitals. So in examples like these, and not only in hospitals, but also often in the streets, and their bodies were sometimes taken away by security forces and had to be, gathered and identified by their loved ones. And of course, we also saw circulating many of those kinds of images as well, including many heartbreaking ones, like a mother, searching for her child among all of these unidentified dead bodies in body bags. And so there were, of course, thousands of such cases. Again, they have been documented, they've been verified. And so, again, everything that I'm talking about here, none of this is to deny the significance of those killings. At the same time, this is something that was also circulating, but that I think many people either ignored or denied. And some people kind of put this in the category of like conspiracy theories. But it is undeniable that these protests, when they took place, especially by early January, January 8th and 9th in particular, were very different from any of the kinds of protests that Iran has had before. And there have been waves of these in several decades, right? But these were easily the most violent and the most really horrific clashes between protesters and security forces. And some people ask this question of, well, how? Like, why did this happen? Why was it that there was so much violence this time? So in tweets like these that the Mossad Twitter page shared on, in this case, December 29th, 2025. This was very shortly after the initial wave of protests began. It was largely by Bazaari merchants and others. And so things were, at that time, only starting to pick up. But the Mossad tweeted this out in Farsi, of course, intended for Iranians in Iran to see this, saying, let's all come out to the streets. The time has come. We are with you, not just from afar and verbally. We are also with you in the field. And then, of course, many people also saw this from Mike Pompeo a few days later, essentially confirming this and admitting that many of the protesters and those clashing with the security forces have Mossad agents with them, right? Happy New Year to every Iranian in the streets, also to every Mossad agent walking beside them. So again, many people did hear about these or they did see them, but I really wanted to actually provide the visual for anybody who thinks that this was somehow a conspiracy theory or that it's not verifiable. No. So again, why did things turn so violent? What was the nature of the crackdowns? And then we'll come back to this point about how this has been leveraged and how it has been used to manufacture this intervention and this war. So many people, again, will not see this kind of stuff because it doesn't really circulate on Western media. And of course, because many people dismiss it because it comes from, state media outlets from inside Iran, including like Arab News. And yet, when you look at the images of the nature of the clashes and what things actually look like on the ground, especially on January 8th and 9th, or the 18th of day as in Iran, you see in these kinds of images people with assault rifles, right, in the midst of these protests, firing back at security forces. The question then becomes, again, how did they get these arms? Because in previous waves of protests that we've had in Iran, we haven't seen armed protests like this. We haven't seen people like in this part of the image shooting down security forces and actually, setting up these kinds of barricades. And so this is like what it actually
and can I
looks
chime
like.
in here
Yeah,
real
please.
quick? Like, I think it's really interesting to think about what's happening in the same time in the United States and the ICE deployment in Minneapolis. And there you also had counter protesters,
Right.
significant counter mobilizations. And yet no one is armed with AR-15s, despite the fact that there are definitely people in Minneapolis and in Minnesota and in the
Yeah.
United States
Yeah.
who are in possession of those weapons. And so I think
Right.
if you, I mean, obviously the contexts are completely different, but I think thinking about those two moments side by side reveals the extent to which it is strange to have heavily armed counter protesters in the midst of protesters in this moment, and how myths, I think Orientalist myths about the always violent Arab or Muslim man really
Yeah.
allow for people outside of those places to just think like, oh yeah, that's no, of course they're heavily armed. No, that actually is not normal.
And in this case, and again, when it comes to Iran and Iranian protesters, this was far from normal. And again, many people didn't see these images, right? Because what we tended to see were like the first ones that I showed, right? Which again, rightly needed to be highlighted because, yes, the Iranian government was killing protesters in that way. To see that there were people, again, armed like this, in this case, coming in, ambushing and shooting at security forces. This is not something that Iranian protesters have done before in any of these waves of
Yeah.
protests. And to show just one final example of this, people, again, armed and coordinated and organized in these ways, including like in these kinds of horrific images, driving into and running over members of security forces. Let me again really emphasize that none of this is meant to in any way justify or to say that it was legitimate what Iranian security forces did against Iranian people and the many lives that were lost, including many innocent lives in these during these protests and during these clashes. But the point that I really want to come back to, and the purpose of this again, is to see not only the complexity of this, but also just to remember how the narrative that has been created is one of the need for intervention because the Iranian government is so cruel and so repressive and so on, which again, in many ways is. Many of the things that it has done are completely unjustifiable, not only in these attacks, but of course in previous waves of protests and ever since it came into existence. Of course, there has been this various forms of repression, many killings, imprisonment, executions, all of these horrible things that the Iranian government has done to the Iranian people. And again, this is among the main reasons why there is so much resentment and anger toward them and this need for change, for regime change. But the fact that this particular set of events and everything leading up to it, the intervention by the US and Israel, has been essentially justified in for many on the grounds that, again, the Iranian government has done this to its own people. There were other forces at play, right? And so these things did not happen by accident. The United States and Israel, of course, knew that there's a possibility, in their view, for regime change in Iran, and they have done everything that they can, at least as
Right.
far back as the previous attacks in June, which were in a way a kind of lead up to this, to these other forms of intervention and covert operations to try to create support for what they want to do.
Well, and I hear you really working hard to preface what you know about the government in Iran and its repressive measures that it takes. I also want to highlight the fact, and I think that you're doing a really good job of this, is that none of these things occur in a vacuum, and that the other really important contextual factor here is sanctions that have been
Yes.
slowly choking the Iranian economy. And I think that's really relevant to bring up too when we're thinking about what's happening with Cuba right now.
Right.
And potentially what might be going to happen in Pakistan imminently. Modi was just in Israel. There was this break-in of the U.S. embassy in Karachi, I think,
Mhm.
because there's this fear that Pakistan might be next. And so
Yeah.
thinking, yes, about these, I mean, no government is perfect. Last I checked, and there's been lots of teams of political scientists who have certified my ability to say that. And so I think we need to be thinking too then about these contextual factors, and what it is that makes people feel so frustrated and what was bringing people into the streets in the first place and why that might have been the case. I want to spend a little bit of time on that note, hearing your thoughts on the aims of Iran, and the United States and Israel
Yeah.
in in this particular moment.
Yes. Um, Yeah, I think that's, again, very important to talk about right now. And I will keep this part of the analysis, I will keep it brief because, again, so much has been said and written about this, including like when you mentioned the sanctions and how that has been a lead up to all of this. And in particular, with Iran as a kind of project, we could say, from a sort of geostrategic point of view for the US and Israel. Again, here I lean on this work that has already been done, right? I think really great scholars have already been talking about this. One of which I would highlight, again, since you mentioned sanctions, and we'll also put this in our video and as links, is a book called How Sanctions Work by Vali Nasr and Nargis Bajoli and others who put this all together and it essentially explained the effect that sanctions have had, particularly in inducing hardships for the Iranian people and creating this, ongoing resentment against the government, against the Islamic Republic, but also just the way that that also has affected so many people on the ground and has tried to create this other kind of narrative about why regime change is necessary. I would also, another book by Vali Nasr, which I think is useful to think about from, again, on the questions of the geostrategy of the views of the United States and Israel, is Iran's Grand Strategy, which came out pretty recently. And that, again, provides a lot of context for all of this. So if we were to ask, what are Iran's goals? What is the Iranian government's aim before this war and now that the war has started? Really, I think it ultimately comes down to a question of survival, right? Because if you look at what the Iranian government has emphasized for going, again, back several decades, this has been really in the making. But in recent years, especially, it, of course, has been weakened in several ways, including, through its proxy groups and how they have been undermined. But ultimately, Iran's sort of strategy in the region has been to prevent the sort of dominance of Israel as a kind of regional hegemon, as well as to maintain its own status and its influence, including among neighboring countries in the region, but also potentially beyond that. So ultimately, the Iranian government, that has been its viewpoint, right? Is to maintain as far as possible internal stability, but also a kind of influence beyond that. Israel, on the other hand, I think undeniably, including according to its own admissions and this whole sort of language that Netanyahu and Smotrich and others often use of the notion of, so-called Greater Israel, and not only for consolidating as much as possible its own control over Gaza and the West Bank, but also beyond that, extending
Southern
not only
Lebanon,
its influence,
Syria.
Lebanon and
Yeah.
Syria, extending not only influence, but also potentially territorial possessions in the region.
Hmm.
So I think it's safe to say that Israel's goal has been to establish itself further as a kind of regional hegemon and to,
And to
to
go back
dominate.
just real quick to statements made by Mike Huckabee in the last few days have
Hmm.
indicated
Right.
that, at least from his perspective, the United States would back them in those efforts.
Exactly. And so they're not hiding it by any means. They're
Yeah.
very open in stating their regional goals and their ambitions. And then the United States, of course, in relation to that, as we all know, continues to see itself and to behave as much as possible, even though it is undermined in a lot of ways. It continues to act as a more global hegemon, right? And to have these spheres of influence. And so, these parts of this particular region are, of course, where the United States has constantly intervened and tried to maintain a form of control and, again, a kind of sphere of influence. But of course, we also see how that functions and has functioned for a very long time in Latin America and elsewhere. So, what is the US trying to get out of this in particular alongside Israel? Again, I don't think it takes much to see if we have been following what the US and Israel have been doing in this region in particular. It's to work together to have this sort of coordinated effort to reshape the region in the image that they want. And that is going to include, as we saw even before the so-called Board of Peace that Trump established, these forms of control that it has sought to have over Gaza in particular, but also over the West Bank and across the region. There is no denying that they have had this vision, including, I think, a pretty twisted vision, including that really strange but really revealing AI video that Trump shared, last year of the plan for Gaza, right?
Oh yeah, I'm
And
on the beach. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And so these things are, I think, we tend to like, in the moment we're really shocked by them when we see them. But like, I mean, this is part of like, not only Trump's strategy, but the US is just to like constantly throw these things at you and
To
then
normalize
you
it.
forget them, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's, this like really aggressive kind of like social media techno-fascism, right?
Right.
Where you do the things and it appears to be absurd, but it's a way of normalizing that form
Yeah.
of discourse. I mean, I think it's interesting that you're talking about this in terms of spheres of influence because some of the analyses that I've heard have been the revival of the Monroe Doctrine
Mm,
with the new name, the Donroe Doctrine,
yeah.
and some of the work that the United States has been doing to say this is our sphere of influence.
Right.
I wonder if part of the idea here is to divide up the world and give Israel control over the region and the so-called Middle East, or what I would refer to as the Swana region,
Mm,
but then also give China Asia and say, okay, we've
mm,
done this. I mean, I think the problem with this sphere of influence that is being divided up now in this moment
mm,
is I think that the Europeans have a lot to say about this.
mm,
It'll be interesting to see how they respond.
yeah.
But I do want to just say that it is really striking to me to think about the United States really setting up what I see as stories about certain governments and then using what, in comparison to the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan,
Mhm.
are really blunt force that
Yes.
entail a lot of civilian casualties. Now there seems to be this idea that there can be more precision, but I think that
Mm,
the outcomes will be the same. And
right.
so we're seeing different ways of doing these things, but I don't think that the aftermath will be much different. I just can't imagine that would.
Yeah.
How could that be? And so it makes it easier for the United States to justify doing these things, but because it doesn't entail as much civilian casualties. But
Mm. Yeah, I mean that has been sort of part of Trump's intentions, we could say, or at least the kind of image that he's tried to portray, which is in many ways contradictory and just false, right? In terms of him claiming to be like the peace president, like goes
it's
without saying.
Orwellian. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like it's not even interesting to say anymore, but it is
Uh,
pretty
it yeah,
remarkable.
it straight up
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And you attack seven countries, and bomb seven countries within the span of a year, and claim to be a peace president. Not to mention the, not only in terms of like the casualties, as you said, and like these claims about like precision strikes, but like the real damage that does, the kinds of instability that it continues to cause. But ultimately, I think to bring it back to this final point, I think we have to be able to see that at the end of the day, and this goes for, again, speaking to a lot of Iranians, those in the diaspora are thinking about what is happening in Iran now, why Israel and the US are doing this, I think we have to be able to see with clarity that the US and Israel are pursuing their own interests, that what they are trying to accomplish in Iran is in line and in keeping with their own vision. And all of these claims about wanting to liberate the Iranian people and that this is going to be good for the Iranian people, I think we really have to look at those with a little more skepticism, a lot more skepticism, to be honest, because there's way too many people who, again, are cheering this whole thing on and thinking that it's great. Now, having said all that, I think that there are many ways in which these outcomes and like where we have arrived now, and again, thinking about this as as you and I have been thinking about, the whole purpose of these discussions is to consider this as a kind of archive of the moment, and like where we are at now on March 1st in the wake of these initial attacks and the death of Khamenei, and the question of what might happen next. I think that when we consider the possible outcomes, and I don't want to sort of start speculating here because nobody knows, right? What might actually happen next. But I think there are things that we can safely assume, and that there are certain paths that are possible in the days ahead. So one of these is that even with the assassination of Khamenei, and now with this appointment of this three-man interim council that is going to lead the country before they try to appoint a new supreme leader, there is essentially a real possibility here that despite these blows and this devastating attack, that the Iranian regime might still be able to hold on, right? And that it's not necessarily going to fall apart so easily.
Yeah, I mean that aligns with some of the analyses that I've read, which is,
Yeah.
Khomeini is, it's important to remember, a figurehead, and that
Yes.
power we know is diffuse and networked, and
Exactly.
that it's you can't. This doesn't exactly work this way.
Exactly.
Which I think is what your comments are pointing to.
And I think, for those who don't have a more kind of in-depth sort of knowledge of the Iranian government and its structure, as well as all of these related institutions, right? So exactly as you said, it's not only the figure of Khamenei, even though the supreme leader, of course, wields all of that power and is like the central figurehead. Yes, it's this very diffuse and, for many people, complicated and really difficult to keep track of, all of the different workings of the kind of government structure that Iran has set up and the institutions that go with that, right? So aside from like the actual branches of government and the parliament and the president and the supreme leader and so on, there is the Expediency Council, there's the Guardian Council, there's the Assembly of Experts. And then, of course, you have all of the military and the affiliated military groups alongside that. So it's not just the conventional regular army, but there's also the IRGC, there's the Basij, and all of these different forces, which, if we're talking about regime change and the possibility of the Iranian government actually collapsing, not only would several of those branches and parts alongside these other institutions, not only would they need to either defect or to collapse altogether, but there would really need to be like a sort of the emergence of like the possibility of like another leader, right? And another way to consolidate a new structure. So all of that is to say, it's really not that easy to topple this kind of government. And of course, ever since the Iranian Revolution, part of the intention was to create it in such a way that it would be really difficult to undermine. And of course, that is among the reasons it has proved so steady despite all of these waves of opposition and protests, as well as now this kind of military intervention. The other possibility, and I'll just keep this part very brief, is that if these attacks continue, if the United States and Israel continue to really pummel Iran in this kind of way as they have been doing, to not only take out other prominent political leaders as well as, important military commanders and others, And to, of course, because if it becomes a kind of war of attrition, the question of morale becomes relevant. And so, how long can not only the Iranian government, but the Iranian people, how long can they withstand this sort of thing? And so, if it is at all actually possible for the Iranian government to collapse or to undergo a major change and a major set of reforms, the two possible pathways that emerge out of that, and this is the final point that I'll end on, is that you could continue to have outside influence by the United States, by attempts by people like Reza Pahlavi to really enter the picture and to try to emerge as this kind of figurehead or kind of leader for the people, although that would be, of course, very complicated for somebody like him who's lived outside of the country for so long. And to what extent would Iranians actually accept anything like that? But the other possibility, which I think if we can be hopeful about anything in a situation like this, and I try to be as much as possible, is that if there were to be a change in government, potentially by the Iranian people themselves, where they actually play a role in instituting a new government, in having democratic elections, and in short, maintaining self-determination and sovereignty for themselves. If that is a possibility, then I think, that could be potentially the best kind of outcome in all of this. But at the same time, I think we have to, especially in these early days and since the start of this war, we have to be very alert and wary of the influence of Israel and the United States. And finally, I think among us as a diaspora, right? And this is again speaking to fellow Iranians abroad. I think we really have to have this moment of self-questioning of like, what is it that the Iranian people themselves on the ground actually want? Are we
Mhm.
really paying
Yeah.
attention to them and to their
Oh,
demands?
yeah.
And how can we better do that moving forward rather than just simply cheering on the fact that now this war has been underway and
Yeah.
Khamenei is dead and all of this, but it's really the question of what next and can we think about that and talk about that together?
Yeah. Well, I think that is a great place to end. I'm glad that we had an opportunity to check in this moment. Like I said earlier, we mentioned a lot of different resources. We'll be putting links to all of these resources and more in the show notes. We also, just by way of preview, I'll say we have another episode coming up with a very special guest that we'll be releasing soon. So stay tuned. And in the meantime, thanks for listening. This is Politics and the Exilic City.